Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really embarking on a journey, diving into one of the world's most, profound and enduring traditions, Buddhism.
Absolutely.
And this isn't about just scratching the surface. Our mission is really to cut through maybe some of the noise, unearth those surprising facts, and give you a truly well-informed understanding. It's a path spanning, over 2,500 years?
Easily. And woven into countless cultures, it's vast.
It really is.
And the map for our deep dive today comes from the Buddhist Religion, a historical introduction. It's a really solid overview.
The 1997 revised edition, right?
That's the one. And it's excellent because it really respects the incredible diversity, the complexity of Buddhist thought and practice and institutions all across the globe. That's key to getting it.
Right, not treating it's just one thing. So our goal for you listening is to walk away with those key insights, those maybe aha moments about its rich history, its core teachings.
And its remarkable adaptability. That's huge.
Yeah, that adaptability. We'll explore how this spiritual path, which started as, simply the Dharma or the Buddha's way, how it blossomed into this global phenomenon we call Buddhism today. So to really understand this profound tradition, where do we even begin? We have to go back right to the start.
Way back. 6th century BCE, ancient India. The Ganges Plain.
Okay, what was the world like then? What was happening?
It was a fascinating time. Kind of chaotic, actually. You had these absolute monarchs building up new cities, big urban centers.
Right?
A money economy was starting to rise. And the traditional elites, the priests and nobles, were kind of getting pushed aside.
So a lot of change, disruption.
Huge disruption. And when that happens, sensitive people, thoughtful members of society, they start questioning the old values.
Yeah.
Asking these radical new questions about life's meaning, about purpose. It creates this fertile ground for completely new ideas to sprout.
And what were the main religious beliefs being questioned? The ones people were pushing back against?
Well, the dominant system was the Vedic tradition, based on the ancient hymns of the Indo-Aryans.
Right.
And the Brahmins, this hereditary priestly caste, they were central. Their whole practice revolved around these elaborate rituals, sometimes even animal sacrifices.
And the belief was?
The belief was that if you performed these rituals perfectly, you could actually compel the gods to grant your wishes, even make them obey.
Wow, compel the gods.
Yeah. This stage, often called Brahmanism, became the main focus, the main target for this anti-Vedic reaction that was really brewing.
Okay. And it's right in the middle of all this change, this spiritual searching, that we meet Siddhartha Gautama. We know the name, maybe the basics, but what was his early life really like? And what specifically pushed him towards, the great renunciation?
Right, Siddhartha. He was born a prince, lived in just extreme luxury, totally shielded from any kind of discomfort.
No.
I mean, the texts say he had separate palaces for each season.
Seriously, palaces for seasons?
That's the tradition. But then he had this profound realization. He saw that no matter how much luxury he had, he, just like everyone else, was subject to aging, illness, and death.
The fundamental human condition.
Exactly. And it wasn't just an idea, it hit him personally, shattered his whole worldview. And that's what led him to, shave his head, leave his home, his wife, his child, and become an ascetic, a wanderer.
Seeking what? What was the goal?
He called it unexcelled security from bondage nirvana. Basically, a lasting, ultimate freedom from all suffering. Later stories, like Asagosha's, really dramatized it with those famous 3 encounters, the old man, the sick man, the corpse seen on chariot rides.
Right, the classic story. But the core was seeing his own mortality.
Yes, seeing it reflected everywhere.
So he's out there seeking this ultimate liberation. How did he go about it? Did he find teachers?
He did, yeah. He sought out the most advanced spiritual teachers of his time, mastered really profound meditative states.
Like what kind of states?
Things called the state of nothingness, and even deeper, neither perception nor non-perception. Incredibly deep trances.
Sounds pretty out there.
It is. They pacified the mind, led to direct knowledge, but he realized pretty quickly, actually, that even these states, however peaceful, they didn't offer the ultimate liberation he was after.
They weren't nirvana.
Exactly. They weren't the final answer to, as he put it, disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, tranquility, superknowledge, awakening, and nirvana. They were steps, but not the destination itself.
Okay, so meditation masters weren't the final answer, and then he famously turned to extreme austerities, right? Almost the opposite approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He basically tried the ancient equivalent of a spiritual crash diet, like you said.
Yeah.
He went eastward to a place called Oruvela near Bodh Gaya.
And what did he do there?
He subjected himself to incredibly severe practices. Things like holding his breath until he had violent headaches
Ooh,
and extreme fasting.
yeah.
Became totally emaciated, skin and bones.
How long did this go on?
6 long years. He had 5 other ascetics with him doing the same thing. But ultimately, he had another realization
Which was?
that this severe self-torture, this mortification, was just as useless for liberation as those abstract meditative states he'd already mastered. Neither extreme worked.
Ah, the middle way starts to emerge.
Precisely. That was his big aha moment. He thought, maybe some physical well-being, not sensual pleasure, but just a healthy body. Maybe that isn't something to fear. Maybe it's necessary for clear thinking, for discernment.
A healthy body for a healthy mind, essentially.
Kind of. That crucial realization, that was his first real step onto what he later called the middle way, avoiding both indulgence and self-punishment.
So, having rejected both those extremes, Gautama finds this spot under the Bodhi tree, and he makes this resolution, right, not to get up until he figures it out.
Exactly. A powerful resolve. And this is where he faces Mara.
Mara. Now, is Mara like a literal devil figure, or?
Well, less an external demon and more the personification of death, delusion, and temptation itself. All the internal obstacle.
So, a psychological battle.
Very much so. First, Mara tried planting seeds of doubt in his mind. Are you sure about this? Maybe go home.
Classic self-doubt.
Right. When that failed, Mara supposedly attacked him with armies. But these armies represented things like sensuality, discontent, fear, doubt, hypocrisy, the craving for fame.
All the mental stuff that holds us back.
Exactly. And the Bodhisattva, Siddhartha, with his deep discernment, just saw them for what they were. He recognized them. And that recognition, that seeing through them, was their defeat.
No battle needed, just seeing clearly.
Pretty much. Later legends, they added the drama of him touching Mother Earth to bear witness to his past good deeds, his merit.
Adds a nice touch. So this profound internal struggle, what insights did he actually gain through the night? What was the awakening itself?
It unfolded in stages through the watches of the night. During the first phase, say 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., he gained the ability to remember his past lives, countless lives.
Wow.
And through this, he saw clearly how karma worked. Good actions, good karma, led to happy rebirths. Bad actions, evil karma, led to miserable ones. This experience is likely the root of the popular Jataka tales, stories of his previous lives.
And that vision you mentioned earlier, it reshaped the whole idea of karma, didn't it?
Fundamentally, that's a crucial takeaway. For Gautama, what really determined your rebirth wasn't about performing the right ritual sacrifice, like the Brahmins thought.
Right.
And it wasn't just about having some kind of abstract knowledge, like in the Upanishads. The radical insight was this. It was the quality of your entire life. And even more specifically, the intention motivating your actions.
Intention, that's the key.
That's the absolute key. Good and bad became qualities of intention, not just the physical act itself. This completely freed ethics from being tied to ritual performance. It was a massive shift in religious thought. Huge.
Okay, so that's the first watch. Past lives, karma, intention. What came next in the second watch?
In the second phase, say 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., he acquired psychic vision. The divine eye, they call it. He could survey the death and rebirth of all living beings, everywhere, the entire cosmos, like looking in a mirror.
Seeing the whole cycle.
Exactly. And this experience empirically verified the doctrines of repeated rebirth, samsara, and the direct consequences of intentional actions, karma. He saw directly that those materialists who denied any afterlife or denied that actions have consequences, they were simply wrong. He saw it.
Wow. Direct verification. And then the final phase, as dawn approached.
The third watch, 2 a.m. till dawn. This is when he gained knowledge of the ending of the asravas.
Asravas. What are those exactly?
Think of them as mental pollutants, outflows, or defilements. Greed, hatred, delusion. The things that keep us trapped in the cycle of suffering.
The core problems.
Right. And ending them involved realizing the principle of pratitya samutpada.
Okay, that's a big one. Dependent co-arising.
Dependent co-arising. It's the absolute heart of the Buddha's awakening. He saw precisely how ignorance, not knowing the true nature of reality, leads to craving, clinging, and ultimately suffering, dukkha, and how that fuels the whole cycle of rebirth.
Like seeing the links in a chain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by meditating deeply on this pattern, this interconnectedness of cause and effect, he was able to unravel it, to break the chain. And that brought release, liberation.
So can you unpack that a bit more for us? Dependent co-arising, how does it really work?
Think of it like a series of dominoes. Ignorance is the first domino. It knocks over mental formations, which knocks over consciousness, and so on, through 12 links, eventually leading to aging and death, and thus more suffering.
A causal chain reaction.
Precisely. But the genius of it is, if you can stop that first domino, ignorance, by developing wisdom and insight, the whole chain reaction stops. The suffering ceases. It's about understanding the process of how suffering arises right here in your present experience, rather than speculating about some external cause. It's very phenomenological, focused on direct awareness.
Okay, focusing on the patterns in our own minds. And how does this connect to suffering, dukkha, and the ultimate goal, nirvana?
Well, the early texts are really clear on this. The conditioned world, the world of suffering, of dependent arising, and the unconditioned freedom from suffering, nirvana, are radically separate. You can't get suffering from absolute freedom.
They're different realms, almost.
In a way, yes. Nirvana literally means extinguishing, like blowing out a candle flame. In this life, it means freedom from the flames of attachment, aversion, agitation, peace.
And after death.
After death.
Yeah.
It means freedom from even the most basic concepts of the describable universe. It implies utter transcendence, freedom from all change, all conditions. It's beyond description, really.
Wow, that is a huge concept. Now, when the Buddha started teaching, did everyone who heard this just get it instantly? Did they all reach nirvana right away?
Oh, definitely not, and that's an important point. Disciples typically attained release in stages. It's a gradual path for most.
Stages? Like what?
First, they might become stream winners, those who've had a first decisive glimpse of the deathless, of nirvana. They've entered the stream. Then they could progress to being once returners, meaning they'd only be reborn once more in the desire realm.
Okay.
Then non-returners, who wouldn't be reborn in the desire realm again, but maybe in higher, purer realms before final nirvana. And finally, the arhats, those who achieved total liberation in this lifetime, just like the Buddha.
So a progression. And even if someone got there quickly.
Yeah, if someone attained awakening very quickly, the understanding was that they must have cultivated the necessary mental qualities, the wisdom and concentration over many, many previous lifetimes. It wasn't just luck.
Right, the groundwork was already laid.
Exactly. And the Buddha himself apparently classified his listeners into different types, understanding that people had different capacities. It showed that deep reflection on your own experience, not just passively hearing the words, was the real key. You had to see it for yourself.
Makes sense. So the Buddha's awakened, the teaching, the Dharma is clear. What about building the community? How did the Sangha, the Buddhist community, actually start to form?
Well, after his second sermon, the story goes, there were 6 fully liberated beings, 6 arhats, including the Buddha himself. Then a pivotal moment came with a rich merchant's son named Yasa.
Yasa.
Yes. He heard the teaching, became an arhat, and ordained as a monk. But significantly, his father, mother, and sisters also heard the teaching and became the very first lay devotees.
The first lay followers, how did they signify that?
They formally took the 3 refuges. They declared 3 times their refuge in the Buddha, their refuge in the Dharma, his teaching, and their refuge in the Sangha, the community of realized beings. This act of allegiance, taking refuge, became the fundamental marker of being a Buddhist. It signifies faith in the Buddha's awakening, the truth of his teaching, and the worthiness of the community supporting the path.
That raises an interesting distinction I've heard about, the ideal Sangha versus the conventional Sangha. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, that's important. The Arya Sangha, the noble or ideal Sangha, refers to all people, whether they're monks, nuns, laymen, or laywomen, who have genuinely attained one of those stages of awakening, who have glimpsed the deathless. They are the true community of the realized.
Okay, defined by attainment.
Right. The Samvarti Sangha, the conventional Sangha, specifically refers to the ordained community, the monks, bhikkhus, and nuns, bhikkhunis. So the two overlap, but they aren't identical. Not every monk is necessarily a stream winner, and a layperson can be a stream winner.
Got it. And the Buddha's followers also formed a wider assembly.
Yes, the Period. This encompassed all 4 groups: monks, nuns, male lay devotees, upasakas, and female lay devotees, upasikas, the whole community.
Beyond the teachings and the community structure, how else did early Buddhists show their devotion? What practices emerged early on?
Well, one incredibly enduring and widespread practice was the cult of relics.
Relics, like parts of the Buddha's body.
Exactly. After the Buddha's cremation, his physical remains, bones, ashes were said to have been divided among various groups and enshrined in stupas.
Stupas, those mound-like structures.
Yes. Memorial shrines or reliquaries. Later, the great Emperor Asoka is famously credited with building something like 84,000 stupas throughout his empire to house these relics. It shows how important this became.
84,000, that's incredible.
It signifies the scale of devotion, certainly. Pilgrimage was also actively encouraged, especially to 4 key sites connected to the Buddha's life.
Which sites were those?
His birthplace, Lumbini, the place of his awakening, Bodh Gaya, where he gave his first sermon, Sarnath, and the place where he passed away into parinirvana, Kushinagar.
The big 4.
Right. Visiting these sites became a powerful way for people to connect with the Buddha's story and cultivate a sense of chastened dispassion, basically, a sense of awe and impermanence that helps reduce clinging.
Okay. And what about the daily life of the monks and nuns? Were they always settled in monasteries?
Actually, early monastic life combined 2 different modes. There was the eremitic, this solitary wanderer style.
Living alone in the forest?
Pretty much, yeah. Wandering with very few possessions, especially during the dry seasons. But then there was also the cenobitic mode, living together in settled communities.
So both wandering and settled life.
Yes. Particularly during the rainy season, the Vasa monks and nuns would settle together in dwellings. This was a time for intensive spiritual practice, study, and handling communal business.
And this eventually led to different types of monks.
It did. Over time, a distinction often arose between town-dwelling monks who might be more involved in scholarship, teaching, administration, interacting with lay supporters, and the forest-dwelling monks who focused primarily on meditation and more austere practices.
Forest monks versus town monks?
Kind of. And this also fostered a really important symbiotic relationship with the lay community, especially merchants, who often provided material support for the monasteries. This patronage was crucial for the spread of Buddhism.
Makes sense. Now, what about women? You mentioned nuns, the bhikkhunis. That must have been pretty radical for ancient India.
It was. The establishment of the Bhikkhun Sangha, the order of nuns, was definitely significant. Although it's important to note, the texts record it being established with the strict rule of subordination to the monk's order.
Subordination?
Yes. And there's even a passage quite controversial today where the Buddha is said to predict that admitting women would actually shorten the lifespan of the pure Dharma in the world.
That sounds problematic.
It is, from a modern perspective. However, at the same time, you have texts within the Pali Canon, like the Therigatha, the verses of the women elders.
What's that?
It's this incredible collection of poems celebrating nuns who attained full arhantship, the highest state of liberation, recognized as equal to the Buddha's own or any male arhants.
So full spiritual equality was recognized, despite the structural hierarchy.
Exactly. It shows that women's capacity for attaining the ultimate goal was definitely acknowledged, even if their institutional position was secondary.
Okay, so we've got the monastics. What about the lay practitioners, the householders? What was their path, their dharma?
They were taught a dharma that was appropriate for their lives, their duties and responsibilities living in the world.
So not necessarily full renunciation.
Right. For happiness in this life, the advice focused on practical things. Diligence in your work, taking care of your possessions, managing money wisely, spending in a balanced way, and importantly, associating with good, ethical people.
Sound advice for anyone, really.
Pretty much. And for happiness in the next life, the focus shifted towards developing conviction in karma, practicing generosity, dana, cultivating virtue, sila, and developing discernment or wisdom, panna.
Generosity, virtue, wisdom.
Those 3, generosity, virtue, and also meditation, pavana, became seen as the fundamental ways for lay people to acquire puchya, or good karmic merit, leading to better rebirths and eventually supporting liberation.
And a core practice for lay virtue was the 5 precepts, wasn't it?
Absolute foundational. The 5 precepts, or panya sila, abstaining from killing living beings.
Intentionally, right. The intention matters.
Crucially, yes, always the intention. Abstaining from stealing, from sexual misconduct, from lying, and from consuming intoxicating drinks or drugs that cloud the mind.
The basic ethical guidelines.
Exactly. And beyond these, the teachings also strongly emphasized reciprocal duties, the responsibilities between children and parents, husband and wife, employer and employee, teacher and student. Creating a harmonious society was part of the lay path.
And could lay people actually become saints, reach those stages of awakening you mentioned?
Yes. Generally, the early schools agreed that lay people, while living as householders, could definitely attain the first 3 stages: stream winner, once returner, and non-returner.
But not full armhandship.
Well, this is interesting. Some schools did believe a layperson could attain full arnentship, but there was a catch.
What was the catch?
The belief was that if a layperson became an arhat, they had to either ordain as a monk or nun pretty much immediately, or they would die within 7 days.
Wow. Why?
The reasoning seems to have been that the lay state, with all its worldly entanglements and lesser purity compared to monastic life, simply couldn't support the profound state of an arhat. It points to this deep connection seen between the renunciate lifestyle and the highest attainment.
Interesting. Okay, so as Buddhism grew within India, how did it interact with the local culture? Did it absorb local beliefs or practices?
Oh, definitely. Popular Buddhism was very adaptable. It seamlessly integrated lots of local forms, symbols, even deities and cults.
Like what?
Well, for example, tree veneration. Worshipping sacred trees was an ancient practice in India, going way back to Indus Valley fertility cults. This was easily transferred to venerating the Bodhi tree, the specific tree under which the Buddha attained awakening.
So it used existing cultural language.
Exactly. And interestingly, in early Buddhist art, for the first few centuries, they avoided depicting the Buddha himself in human form.
Really?
It seems to have been out of reverence, perhaps to emphasize his transcendence beyond physical form, or to focus attention on the Dharma, the path itself. So instead, they used symbols,
Symbols like.
an empty throne, a pair of footprints, a Dharma wheel representing the teaching, or the Bodhi tree itself.
When did actual Buddha images start appearing?
Much later, generally after about 100 BCE, it was likely a response to the rise of popular devotionalism, bhakti, which was also growing within Hinduism at the time. People wanted an image to focus their devotion on.
And what did those early images look like?
The Mathura style, for instance, from central India, often depicted these massive, powerful, rather earthy Buddha figures. They often had the hand gesture of protection, the Abhaya Mudra, and sometimes resembled local yaka figures, powerful nature spirits often worshipped for worldly benefits like wealth or health.
So the art reflected popular needs, maybe?
It seems so. It suggests a popular Buddhism responding to people's everyday concerns, alongside the more philosophical or monastic streams. Okay. This brings us to a really major turning point. The rise of Mahayana Buddhism. This sounds like a huge shift, almost a split. What was driving it?
It was absolutely monumental. This happened roughly between 100 BCE and 100 CE. It coincided with India shifting more towards a written culture, preserving texts in writing. And part of this movement seems to have been a backlash, particularly in South India, against the highly analytical, scholastic approach of the Abhidharma schools.
People felt it was too dry, too intellectual.
Something like that. Some felt it was missing the core, maybe the heart, the compassionate essence of the Buddha's original teaching. So new scriptures, new sutras began to appear.
New sutras, where did they come from?
Well, the claim made within the Mahayana tradition was that these were actually hidden or secret teachings given by the Buddha himself, perhaps to more advanced disciples, or stored away by celestial beings until the world was ready for them.
Okay, and what did these new sutras say? They often presented a radical critique. They asserted that the earlier ideal, the arhat who achieves liberation just for themselves, might have actually missed the bigger picture. They argued the arhat goal was perhaps a bit selfish or incomplete.
Challenging the existing ideal.
Directly challenging the established orthodoxy. They were saying, in effect, there's a higher, broader path, a great vehicle Mahayana.
So what were the key new concepts Mahayana introduced? What made it great?
One absolutely central concept was shunyata, usually translated as emptiness. This took the earlier Buddhist teaching of anatman, or not self, the idea that there's no permanent, independent soul in a person.
Right, I remember that.
Mahayana expanded this radically. It wasn't just the person who lacked inherent existence, but all phenomena, all dharmas, the fundamental building blocks of experience, were also declared empty of any intrinsic independent nature. Everything is interdependent, relational. Nothing stands alone.
Wow. Emptiness of everything. That's profound.
Deeply profound. And alongside this came the ideal of the bodhisattva.
The bodhisattva. What's that about?
The bodhisattva is a being who, out of immense compassion, karuna, for all sentient beings trapped in suffering, makes a vow not just to attain their own liberation, but to postpone their final entry into nirvana until all other beings are saved first.
Delaying their own enlightenment for others.
Exactly. It's a path focused on universal salvation, driven by wisdom, understanding emptiness, and boundless compassion. This became the central heroic ideal of Mahayana.
That's a very different emphasis from the arhat.
Very different. And this Mahayana worldview also opened up the cosmos. It introduced the idea of countless Buddhas and Bodhisattvas existing simultaneously throughout infinite universes, each presiding over their own Buddha land or Pure Land.
Like Amitabha's Pure Lamb.
Precisely. Cosmic Buddhas like Amitabha in his Western paradise, Sukhavati,
Yeah.
Atabi in the East, the medicine Buddha Hayajaguru,
Hmm.
these became objects of devotion and aspiration. You could aim to be reborn in their Pure Lands, where enlightenment was easier to attain.
And even the historical Buddha was seen differently.
Yes. Texts like the hugely influential Lotus Sutra portrayed the historical Gautama Buddha not just as a human teacher who lived and died, but as an expression of an everlasting, cosmic, ever-present, compassionate father figure who skillfully uses different teachings to guide beings according to their capacity.
So a much grander cosmic vision. But the earlier schools, the ones Mahayana sometimes called Hinayana or the lesser vehicle, they didn't just vanish, did they?
No, not at all. That's important to remember. Hinayana is often seen as a pejorative term used by Mahayanists, so scholars often prefer terms like Nikaya Buddhism or early Buddhism.
Yeah.
And these schools remained very strong in India for centuries.
They coexisted.
Yes. We know from accounts of Chinese pilgrims, like Xuanzang in the 7th century CE, that these non-Mahayana schools were actually still in the majority in many parts of India at that time.
Really? Even that late?
Yeah. They had their own thriving monastic universities. They translated their canons from Pali into Sanskrit to engage in wider philosophical debates, and they continued to innovate, especially in fields like formal logic and epistemology, the study of knowledge. Thinkers like Dignaga and Dharmakirti were giants of Indian philosophy, and they came from these traditions.
So it was a complex, dynamic landscape, not just one replacing the other.
Exactly. Very diverse, very philosophically active.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit again. Tantrism and Vajrayana, this often sounds like the most esoteric, maybe even controversial form of Buddhism. Where did this come from?
Right, Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, or Buddhist Tantra. This emerged somewhat later, really taking shape from around the 6th century CE onwards. It seems to have absorbed significant influences, practices, and concepts from contemporary Hindu tantric movements, particularly Shaivism, the traditions focused on the god Shiva.
What kind of influences?
Shaivism often focused on achieving intense states of aesthetic, sensual, and spiritual bliss. Buddhist Tantra adapted some of these methods, emphasizing complex rituals that utilize the body through postures and gestures, mudras, speech through chanting powerful syllables, mantras, and mind through intricate visualizations.
Mantras and mudras, that sounds familiar.
Yes, and a key belief was that these sacred words, these mantras, weren't just symbolic.
Yeah.
They had inherent power, even the power to influence or coerce deities if used correctly.
Coerce deities, that sounds different from early Buddhism.
It is a different emphasis. Another core practice was Diva Yoga, or deity yoga. Here, the practitioner would visualize themselves as a particular Buddha or deity, meditating on their qualities, imitating their form, eventually aiming to dissolve the separation and realize their own innate identity with that enlightened being.
Taking on the form of the deity.
In a meditative sense, yes. Now, while some tantric practices were aimed at generating merit or achieving worldly goals, the most advanced, the so-called unexcelled yoga tantras, Nilottara Yoga Tantra, included practices that were quite radical, sometimes involving the ritualized use of substances or even sexual yogas, Karma Mudra, that deliberately violated conventional social and monastic taboos.
Sexual yoga. In Buddhism.
Yes, in certain specific advanced tantric contexts, these were highly esoteric and often required initiation. Later, especially as Tantra became more integrated into mainstream monasticism, these practices were often reinterpreted symbolically as internal visualizations meant to work with subtle energies within the body, rather than literal physical acts, especially for celibate monks and nuns.
So often symbolic interpretation, but what's really fascinating, you mentioned, is the role of women in Tantrism.
Yes, this is a really striking feature. Compared to some other forms of Buddhism at the time, women played a remarkably prominent, even central role in tantric circles, especially in the early period. They were revered as yoginis or dakinis, powerful female practitioners, sometimes seen as embodiments of goddesses or sources of wisdom and spiritual power.
So female figures were important.
Critically important. You have historical figures like Princess Lokamekara, who was a renowned tantric master and leader in the 8th or 9th century. It represents a unique strand within Buddhism where female spiritual authority was highly valued.
That's a really rich and complex picture of Buddhism evolving within India. But then, as you mentioned, it largely disappeared from its homeland. What were the main reasons for that decline?
It's a sad part of the story. The decline was gradual, starting perhaps earlier, but the major blows came from a long series of invasions by Muslim Turkic groups, starting around the 8th century but intensifying dramatically from the 10th to the 12th centuries.
Invasions, what impact did they have?
Devastating impact. These invaders systematically targeted and destroyed major Buddhist monasteries, which were also centers of learning places like Nalanda, Vikramasila. Libraries were burned, monks were killed or forced to flee, statues were smashed, the institutional heart of Indian Buddhism was ripped out.
The infrastructure was destroyed.
Pretty much. And without the monasteries, the centers of learning, the patronage networks, it became very difficult for Buddhism to sustain itself in India in the long run, though small pockets survived. But the crucial thing is, by this time, Buddhism wasn't just an Indian religion anymore.
It had already spread.
Exactly. It had already put down deep, strong roots in many other countries across Asia, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Tibet. So while it faded in its birthplace, its journey was far from over. It was already transforming and being transformed by these new cultures.
Okay, so let's follow that journey. Let's connect this to the bigger picture and look at how Buddhism adapted as it spread. Maybe start with Nepal. What does its story tell us?
Nepal is fascinating because it shows this intense process of syncretism, blending, especially with Hinduism.
Syncretism mixing together.
Yeah. In Nepal, particularly in the Kathmandu Valley, you find deities from both Buddhist and Hindu pantheons often worshipped side by side, sometimes seen as interchangeable. Religious identity even became intertwined with the caste system, which is quite unlike early Buddhism.
Tied to caste. How so?
You have specific castes, like the Vajrayanas and Shakyas, who traditionally function as Buddhist priests and ritual specialists, serving lay communities. Their status is hereditary. It's a radical departure from the Buddha's own attitude towards caste, but it seems to have been a way for Buddhism to survive and find its niche within a predominantly Hindu social structure.
Adaptation for survival. What about Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia? That's often seen as the heartland of Theravada Buddhism.
Right. Sri Lanka became, and remains, a major center of Theravadan orthodoxy. They pride themselves on preserving the Pali Canon, considered the oldest collection of Buddhist scriptures.
Preserving the original teachings.
That's the ideal. But they also face challenges. During the colonial period, under British rule, monks lost many of their traditional roles in education and healthcare as Western systems were imposed.
That must have caused a reaction.
It did. It sparked a movement sometimes called Protestant Buddhism. This was an effort by figures like Anagarika Dharmapala to revitalize Buddhism and present it in a way that could stand up to Christian missionary critiques and appeal to modern sensibilities. They emphasized Buddhism as rational, scientific, philosophical, often downplaying ritual aspects.
Defining it against the colonizer's religion.
In part, yes, trying to reclaim its value in a modern context.
And in somewhere like Thailand, what does popular Buddhism look like there?
Thai popular Buddhism is a really interesting mix. Karma is definitely understood as the overarching moral law, do good, do bad, get bad. But daily practice often blends this seamlessly with much older animist beliefs.
Animist, like belief in spirits.
Exactly. Belief in local spirits, spirit possession, these protective amulets, magic, divination, even things like putting hex signs on coffins at funerals to ward off trouble.
Wow. So a real mix.
A very rich mix. You also see Brahmanical influences, Hindu elements like auspicious times determined by astrology, numerology, concerns about ritual pollution, especially around death.
And temporary ordination is common too, right?
Very common for young men, yes. Often seen as a rite of passage before marriage, a way to make merit for their parents. It's deeply embedded socially. But it's not all syncretism. You also have important reform movements in Thailand.
Like who?
Well, influential force monks like Ajahn Chah or Ajahn Mun emphasized rigorous meditation practice. And figures like Buddhadasa Bhikkhu actively challenged the syncretic elements, arguing for a return to what he saw as the pure core teachings of the Buddha, often interpreting them in psychological or philosophical terms. So there's always this tension between popular practice and reformist ideals.
Fascinating. Now let's jump over to East Asia. China. That's a whole different cultural ballgame, isn't it? Deeply shaped by Confucianism and Taoism. How did Buddhism even fit in there?
It faced real challenges initially. Significant resistance, especially from the Confucian establishment.
Why the resistance?
Confucianism valued family, social hierarchy, and service to the state. Buddhism, with its monasticism, monks leaving their families, being celibate, Not engaging in productive labor in the conventional sense, accumulating tax-exempt land seemed to undermine all of that.
It looked antisocial, almost.
From a strict Confucian viewpoint, yes.
Yeah.
So Buddhists in China had to be skillful in how they presented their teachings. They argued, for instance, that Buddhism actually supported filial piety. You could repay your parents' kindness even more profoundly by teaching them the Dharma and helping them attain liberation.
Finding common ground.
Exactly. They also argued that the doctrine of karma helped maintain social order, as people would strive to do good. And the sheer scale of translating the vast Buddhist scriptures from Sanskrit and other Indian languages into Chinese was a monumental undertaking over centuries. This process itself profoundly shaped Chinese Buddhism, shifting the emphasis much more towards written texts compared to the oral traditions that were dominant earlier.
The power of the written word.
Immense. And one truly momentous development in China was the successful establishment of a fully ordained Bhikkhu Sangha, the order of nuns.
The nuns' order. Why was that so significant in China?
Because it offered Chinese women a socially acceptable, spiritually valued alternative to marriage and family life. It provided a path for religious vocation and intellectual pursuits outside the direct control of male family members, which was quite extraordinary in that society.
A space for women.
A very important one. And China also saw the development of distinctively Chinese schools of Buddhist thought, really adapting the Indian ideas into their own cultural context.
Which schools were the main ones?
Well, there was Tiantai, founded by Xi, brilliant for its comprehensive system that classified all the diverse Buddhist teachings into a coherent hierarchy, culminating in the Lotus Sutra.
Okay.
Then Huayan, based on the Avahamsaka Sutra, famous for its incredibly intricate philosophy of interpenetration, the idea that everything in the universe contains and reflects everything else, like Indra's net of jewels.
Mind-bending stuff.
Absolutely. Then you have Pure Land Buddhism, Jingtu, which became and remains arguably the most popular form across East Asia. It emphasizes faith in the grace of Amitabha Buddha and chanting his name, Yanfo, with the aspiration to be reborn in his Western Pure Land, Sukhavati. Very accessible.
Faith-based.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, Chan, which we know better by its Japanese name, Zen. Chan emphasized direct experience, meditation, and the possibility of sudden awakening, often distrusting excessive reliance on scriptures. It used unconventional teaching methods like the paradoxical dialogues later known as kungans or koans, and it had a huge influence on Chinese art, poetry, and culture.
Zen. Right. So how is Buddhism faring in the Chinese cultural sphere today? Maybe look at Taiwan as an example.
Taiwan's an interesting case. It's seen a significant Buddhist revival, especially since the latter half of the 20th century. This seems partly fueled by rapid economic development, which has brought prosperity, but also, for some, a sense of spiritual emptiness or alienation.
Modernity's anxieties.
Perhaps. And women are playing an increasingly prominent role, making up a large majority of the ordained Sangha in Taiwan now. You also see the rise of massive, highly organized, lay Buddhist organizations.
Lay organizations? Like what?
The most famous is probably the Tu Chi Foundation, founded by a nun, Master Cheng Yen. They're huge, involved in charity, disaster relief, medical care, education, environmental work, both in Taiwan and internationally.
Socially engaged Buddhists.
Very much so. And they explicitly link this social service, this compassionate action, to personal spiritual purification. The idea is that helping others is a way to wash away your own mental defilements and express your inherent Buddha nature. It's a powerful modern interpretation of the Bodhisattva path.
Fascinating. Okay, let's briefly touch on Korea and Japan before we move towards the West. Any key characteristics there?
Well, in both Korea and Vietnam, historically, Buddhism often became intertwined with national identity, serving as a kind of spiritual bulwark against foreign invasions, particularly from China. Korean kings sometimes even adopted Buddhist titles like universal monarch, Chakravartin, to legitimize their rule.
Religion and state linked?
Often, yes. In Korea, the legacy of Japanese occupation in the 20th century also had a major impact, particularly forcing a relaxation of monastic celibacy rules, which led to a lasting split within the Korean Sangha between celibate and married monks, something still debated today. Modern Korean Buddhism puts a strong emphasis on education and running social welfare programs.
And Japan, we mentioned Zen and Pure Land.
Right. Japan initially adopted Buddhism largely as a state cult in the Nara period, used for protecting the nation. It uniquely integrated with Japan's indigenous Shinto beliefs, often by declaring the native kami, the Shinto deities, to be local manifestations or protectors of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas.
Kami as Buddhas.
Or emanations, yes. Later, during the Kamakura period, a time of social upheaval, You saw the rise of new sects that really aimed to simplify Buddhism and make it accessible to everyone, not just the elite. Pure Land schools like Jodo Shu and Jodo Shinshu emphasized faith in Amitabha, Amida in Japanese, and reciting the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, as the primary practice, especially crucial during what they saw as the degenerate age of the Dharma, Mappo, when attaining enlightenment through self-effort was considered almost impossible.
So reliance on other power.
Exactly. And Zen also flourished during this time, brought from China. You had Aisai establishing Rinzai Zen with its emphasis on koan practice, and Dogen establishing Soto Zen, emphasizing just sitting, meditation, shikantaza. And post-World War II, Japan saw an explosion of new religions, Shinshukyu, many with Buddhist roots, like Soka Gakkai, based on Nichiren Buddhism, or Rishisho Koseikai.
What are they like?
Risho Koseikai, for example, blends elements like faith healing, group counseling focusing on ancestral karma, reverence for the Lotus Sutra, often within a social structure that reflects traditional Japanese, even Neo-Confucian, values about family and community harmony. It shows Buddhism continuing to adapt.
It really does. Okay, so Buddhism has this incredibly rich, diverse history across Asia. How did it then make the leap to the West, especially in the 20th century? What drew Westerners in?
Well, serious Western academic interest began in the 19th century with colonialism and philology. But popular interest, particularly in Zen, really took off in the mid-20th century. Part of the appeal seems to have come from what some scholars call a crisis of cultural relativism in the West.
Crisis of cultural relativism, what does that mean?
Think about the impact of thinkers like Nietzsche, Freud, the World Wars, the decline of traditional religious authority. Many Western intellectuals and artists started questioning the foundations of their own culture, the idea of absolute objective truth, the dominance of rationality.
Looking for alternatives.
Exactly. And Buddhism, especially Zen, as it was often presented, seemed to offer an alternative. Teachers like D.T. Suzuki were hugely influential in interpreting Zen for a Western audience. He often portrayed it as something beyond culture, beyond dogma, a direct experience of reality, an appreciation for beauty in everyday life, intuition over intellect. This resonated deeply with people feeling disillusioned with Western materialism or traditional religion.
Suzuki was key then.
Immensely important, though some scholars now critique his presentation as perhaps overly romanticized or decontextualized, but he opened the door for many.
So this influx of interest, the establishment of centers in the West, has it been smooth sailing? What challenges has Western Buddhism faced as it's tried to put down roots?
It definitely hasn't been without challenges. One major area has been dealing with ethical scandals involving prominent teachers or Dharma heirs.
Scandals, what kind?
Issues around abuses of power, financial impropriety, sexual misconduct. These have forced Western Buddhist communities into some really difficult and often painful conversations.
About what?
About fundamental questions. What are the appropriate ethical norms for Buddhist teachers and communities in a Western context? Does spiritual attainment, or awakening, somehow place a teacher beyond conventional ethics? How valid is the idea of officially recognized awakening anyway? What's the right balance of power between charismatic teachers and the lay community?
Really grappling with authority and ethics.
Yes, and it's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? The very cultural relativism, the questioning of absolutes that drew many Westerners to Buddhism in the first place, now presents a kind of internal crisis within Western Buddhism itself when it comes to establishing clear ethical foundations and accountability structures in these new cultural settings.
How to adapt the old forms without losing the core principles.
That's the crux of it.
So amidst these challenges, are there calls for reform? What does the future look like? What are the positive trends or new directions?
Oh yes, there's a lot of dynamic energy and adaptation happening. One interesting trend is the effort to combine or integrate insights from different Buddhist traditions, Theravada, Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Pure Land. This is facilitated because, really for the first time since Buddhism left India, practitioners from all these diverse lineages share a common language, which is often English in the West.
Cross-pollination between traditions.
Exactly. There's also generally a much stronger role for lay practitioners in leadership and teaching compared to some traditional Asian contexts, and certainly a greater emphasis on gender equality, with many prominent female teachers and leaders. Though it's worth noting these aren't entirely unprecedented. We saw strong lay movements and female figures in Asia, too.
Right. Anything truly unprecedented in the West.
Perhaps the most radical shift is in how the third refuge in the Sangha, is sometimes being redefined.
Redefined how?
In some circles, particularly those influenced by secular mindfulness movements, The Sangha is being interpreted much more broadly to include basically anyone who practices Buddhist meditation
Mhm.
or identifies with Buddhist values, regardless of whether they formally take refuge, identify as Buddhist, or adhere to specific doctrines.
So Sangha as just a support network.
Almost like a psychological or social support network for practice, yeah. This is quite different from the traditional understanding of Sangha as either the ordained monastic community or the community of realized beings, the Arya Sangha.
What are the implications of that broadening?
Well, on the one hand, it makes Buddhist practices accessible to more people. On the other hand, it leads to significant fragmentation and makes it harder to define what is distinctively or essentially Buddhist anymore. Even core doctrines like karma and rebirth are sometimes seen as optional or controversial within these broader communities.
So the challenge is finding unity amidst diversity.
Precisely. How do you maintain some kind of authentic connection to the tradition's core principles while allowing for the incredible diversity of practices and interpretations that are naturally emerging as Buddhism interacts with modern, global, often secular cultures? That's the big question facing Buddhism today, both East and West.
As we wrap up this deep dive, it is just abundantly clear, isn't it? Buddhism isn't this single, monolithic thing. Not at all.
Not even close.
It's this incredibly vibrant, constantly adapting, multifaceted tradition. Its whole history is like this amazing tapestry woven across centuries and continents. A testament, really, to the enduring human search for meaning, for connection, for liberation from suffering in this complicated world.
Absolutely. And what's truly fascinating, I think, is that despite all the incredible diversity we've touched on, from ancient Indian monks debating logic, to Tibetan yogis visualizing deities, to Thai villagers appeasing spirits, to modern Westerners doing mindfulness on an app, that core quest remains.
The quest to understand suffering and find freedom.
Exactly. That thread runs through it all. And it makes you wonder, if some teachers say the real holy place isn't a location, but it's right here in the present awareness of your own mind. Well, how might that change how we think about our own daily journeys, our own search for little moments of awakening wherever we happen to be?
That is a powerful thought to ponder as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the incredibly rich history of Buddhism.
My pleasure.
We really hope it sparked some new insights for you, maybe answered some questions, and perhaps even sparked a little more curiosity about this tradition and the world around you.